My name is Kate Doyle, and I was 54 years old the morning I drove to the company I co-own, and found that my key card no longer opened the door. I sat in the parking lot I had crossed for 26 years, watching a security guard I'd hired shake his head at me through the glass, and I understood that sometime the night before, my father had handed all of it to my brother. I want to be clear about one thing before I tell you the rest. This is not a story about a woman who wanted her family to love her. It is a story about who was actually keeping that company alive, and what happened when they forgot to check the paperwork. The memo went out at 6 in the morning, company-wide. Effective immediately, Peter Doyle will serve as Chief Executive Officer. My name appeared once near the bottom, in a line promising I would still have a place. I had rebuilt that fleet and renegotiated every contract keeping the lights on. And I learned I'd been demoted from the same email that reached the night dispatchers. By the time I got home, Peter had reassigned my parking spot. I could picture his smile, easy and certain. The smile of a man who had never once been told no. But here is the part my family did not expect. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't beg for my job. I sat at my kitchen table and made 2 calls, one to our bank, one to a director, because I knew 2 things that memo forgot. I knew what my share of the company let me do, and what my brother's expensive expansion was quietly built on. There was already a board meeting on the calendar. That memo wasn't the end of my story. It was the fuse. But before I tell you how all of this unfolded, let me stop for a moment. I'd love to know how you're doing today, really. And tell me where in the world you're watching from. I'm always amazed at how far these stories travel, from small towns to cities on the other side of the ocean. If you believe the people who actually do the work should be the ones holding the wheel, stay with me to the end, and consider subscribing so these stories keep finding you. Because what my brother never understood is that a title is not the same thing as control. My father, Gerald Doyle, started this company in 1984 with 2 second-hand trucks and a reputation for never missing a delivery. For a long time, that reputation was enough. But somewhere in the years I was raising my own children and running the dispatch desk part-time, the business began to rot from the inside. Fuel prices climbed. Our trucks aged past the point of repair. A hard recession thinned our customers down to a nervous few, and the bank that had once courted us started sending letters with words like default and acceleration buried in the fine print. I still remember the winter my father sat at his desk with his head in his hands and told me, very quietly, that he did not think Doyle Freight would live to see the spring. I could have walked away. I had an accounting degree and standing offers in the city that paid nearly double what my father could. Instead, I stayed. I rebuilt our routes so we stopped bleeding money on empty return trips. I sold off the trucks that were draining us and financed a leaner, newer fleet. I flew out to sit across the table from the customers we had neglected, and I won back the accounts that actually mattered. It took 3 brutal years. But the company that was supposed to die that winter turned its first honest profit since I had been a girl sweeping that very warehouse floor. No one in my family said thank you, and I did not ask them to. I want you to understand how I became an owner, because it matters for everything that comes next. I did not inherit my stake, and no one handed it to me out of love. During the worst years, the company could not pay me, so I took equity instead of a salary, signing away the wages I was owed, again and again, in exchange for shares on paper. When the bank demanded a personal guarantee to refinance our debt, it was my house I put on the line, not my father's and not my brother's. So by the time Doyle Freight was strong again, I was not simply Gerald's daughter who happened to work there. I was the largest working shareholder in the company and its chief operating officer. That was never a secret. It was written down, signed, witnessed, and filed. My brother Peter came back to the company only once it was safe to. Peter is charming in a way I have never been. He can walk into a room full of skeptical warehouse managers and walk back out with a signed contract and 3 new friends. Our father adored that about him. He saw in Peter the effortless salesman he had always wished he could be. And I will be fair to my brother. He genuinely believed in what he was selling. He was not a con man. He was a true believer, and the thing he believed in was growth. Bigger terminals. More trucks. New regions on the map. He talked about doubling the company in 5 years the way other people talk about the weather, as though it were simply going to happen, as though wanting it badly enough would make it safe. There was only one problem, and I raised it more than once in writing. in the same calm and specific way I raise everything. Peter's expansion was not funded by profit. It was funded by debt, a large loan with conditions attached, the kind of loan that comes with tripwires you cannot see until you step on them. And nearly all of the growth he promised leaned on one enormous customer renewing one enormous contract. I had managed that account for 11 years. I knew how it breathed. I told my father, plainly, that we were building a very tall house on a very narrow foundation. He told me I had spent so long saving the company that I'd forgotten how to let it grow. Peter told me, smiling, that not everyone was built to think big. And so the two of them stopped listening, right at the moment they should have started. My father and Peter had dinner on a Thursday, the two of them alone, and by Friday morning the decision was simply done. There was no board discussion, no conversation with me, no warning. I found out the way the newest hire on the loading dock found out. My phone buzzed at 6:04 in the morning with a company-wide email, my father's name at the top and my future rearranged at the bottom. Peter was CEO now, the memo said, and would lead the company into its next chapter. I, the person who had dragged that company back from the edge of its own grave, was reduced to a single reassuring sentence promising that I would still, somehow, be welcome. Then I set the phone down, poured my coffee, and got dressed for work anyway, because there were trucks that needed to roll whether or not my father remembered who kept them rolling. I didn't get the chance to roll anything. My key card died against the reader at the side entrance, the light blinking red where it had blinked green for 25 years. Marcus, the security guard I had personally hired, wouldn't meet my eyes as he told me, apologetically, that he'd been instructed not to let me pass the lobby. Overnight, someone had removed me as a signatory on the company's bank accounts. My login to the operations system, the one I had built the workflows inside of, no longer existed. My office, they said, was being reorganized. When I finally reached Peter by phone, he was breezy about it, almost kind. He said he was only establishing clean lines of authority, that it wasn't personal, that of course we would find the right role for me once things settled. My brother had locked me out of the company I half-owned and called it good management. Here is what I want you to notice, because it is the whole difference between this story and the one my brother thought he was writing. I did not stand in that lobby and make a scene. I did not send a furious email to the entire staff. I did not call my father and cry down the phone. I drove home, sat down at the same kitchen table where I had done 20 years of this company's books, and I pulled my own copies of the documents. Not to discover anything. I already knew what they said. I simply needed them in front of me. The shareholders' agreement. My stock certificates. The provision, in plain type, spelling out exactly what a shareholder holding my percentage was entitled to do. A man had just handed my brother a title. What he had not done, what he could not do from a podium or a memo, was hand him the votes. Then I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Priya Nader, our relationship manager at Meridian Bank, a woman I had spent years being honest with when honesty was expensive. I didn't ask her to take my side. I asked her one careful question about the covenants attached to the expansion loan. The financial conditions the company had promised to keep, and what would happen if we didn't. Her pause told me more than her answer did. The second call was to Art Mendez, who had built this company alongside my father and still sat on our board. Art had watched me save the place. He had also watched Peter's plan with a quiet, growing dread. I wasn't gathering secrets or building a trap. I was simply opening 2 lines that my brother, in all his celebrating, had forgotten were even connected to the wall. While I sat with the truth, Peter threw a party. Not a literal one, though there was cake in the break room, and a speech I heard about secondhand. He stood in front of the staff, and told them the era of playing small was over. He announced he was fast-tracking the expansion he had been dreaming of, 2 new terminals, a fresh fleet, another region on the map, and that he intended to move now, while the market was still warm. To pay for it, he was taking on more debt, layered on top of the loan that already had the whole thing balanced on a wire. He had no idea he was standing on the exact fault line I had spent months trying to warn him about. And for the first time since my key card turned red, I felt something other than grief. I felt the ground begin to shift under his feet, and I knew he couldn't feel it yet. In the days after the lockout, I learned what my 2 phone calls had really told me. Priya couldn't say much, she had her own duties to the bank, but she confirmed the shape of it, and the shape was frightening. The expansion loan Peter loved so much carried a covenant. a promise written into the contract that the company would keep its debt below a fixed multiple of its earnings. Cross that line, and Meridian Bank was no longer just our patient lender. It gained the right to demand immediate repayment of the entire balance, or to force changes in how the company was run. It was the kind of clause nobody thinks about while the money is flowing and the trucks are full. But Peter was about to pour fresh debt onto the pile, while the earnings side of that equation quietly thinned. He was walking us toward the line at a run, and he thought he was sprinting toward a finish. And then there was the customer. Peter's entire expansion rested on one account: Coastal Grocers, a regional grocery chain that moved enough freight through us to fill the new terminals he wanted to build. On paper, the math worked beautifully, but only if Coastal renewed its contract at the volumes Peter had penciled in. I had managed that relationship for 11 years. I knew their buyers by their first names and their children's names. And I knew something Peter's spreadsheet did not. Coastal had a new head of logistics, a man who believed in splitting freight across multiple carriers. And he had already started asking quiet questions about whether Doyle was still the safe, steady partner it used to be. Peter had built his whole cathedral on a single pillar. He had never once walked over to check whether that pillar was cracking. I had. It was. I did not keep any of this to myself. That is the part one need you to hear, because later my family would try to tell a different story. I wrote it all down: the covenant, the multiple, the Coastal exposure, the timing, in a calm numbered memo, and I sent it to my father and to Peter both. I did not gloat or threaten. I laid out the risk the way I would lay it out for any board. Here is the danger, here is the math, here is what I recommend. My father read 3 lines and called me. He told me I had spent so long being the one who worried about money that I had forgotten the company needed someone brave enough to spend it. Peter didn't call at all. He forwarded my memo to our father with a single line on top: sour grapes. That was his entire response to the numbers that were about to come for him. The next morning I drove out to the yard. Not the executive floor, the yard, where the trucks idle at dawn and the real company actually lives. I have known some of those drivers for 20 years. I have covered their shifts when their kids were born and their parents were dying. And one by one, leaning against their rigs with coffee going cold in their hands, they told me the same thing. They were scared. They had heard about the expansion, the new terminals, the borrowed money. They had lived through the near collapse once already, and they could feel the company tightening again in a way the men in the corner offices could not. "You'll fix it, though," an old driver named Sal said to me, like it was simple fact. He had no idea I'd been locked out of the building. I didn't have the heart to tell him. I just promised him I was working on it. By the end of that month, the numbers stopped being a warning and started being a fact. The figures that landed on the last day of the month, the ones I still received because someone in accounting quietly forgot to cut off my access to the reports, showed exactly what I had predicted. Margins were compressing. The new spending was outrunning the revenue meant to cover it. When I ran the covenant calculation myself, at my kitchen table, at 11 o'clock at night, I could see how close we already were to the line. Not someday. Not in theory. Within a quarter, maybe 2, unless something changed, Doyle Freight would breach the terms of its largest loan. Peter thought he was building the future. What he was actually building was a countdown. And the strangest part, the part one keep coming back to, is that the only person in the family who could see the clock ticking was the one they had just locked outside. So I stopped waiting to be invited back into a company I already partly owned. Somewhere in the shareholders' agreement my father had signed decades ago, back when he trusted the future more than he feared it, was a clause I had read 100 times. Any shareholder holding more than a set percentage of the company could formally demand a special meeting of the board. Not request one, demand one. And the board was obligated to convene. I held well above that threshold. Peter, in his rush to change the locks, had never stopped to ask what my signature on those shares actually entitled me to. So I did not send an angry letter. I sent a formal, precise notice, drafted with a corporate attorney, invoking my right and setting the agenda. The company's debt covenants and its exposure to a single customer. It was 3 paragraphs long. It was completely bulletproof. And it landed on the board like a stone through glass. The first person to answer was Art Mendez. Art had poured 30 years into this company beside my father. And when he retired he kept his shares and his seat on the board because he still cared how the story ended. I did not go to him asking for loyalty. I went to him with numbers. I laid out the covenant, the multiple, the coastal exposure, the same memo my father had dismissed in 3 lines, and Art, who had read 1,000 balance sheets in his life, went very quiet. Then he said the thing I will always respect him for. He told me he would not vote for me because I was Gerald's daughter, and he would not vote against Peter because he was reckless. He would vote for whatever kept the company solvent and honored what the board owed to everyone who depended on it. That was all I had ever wanted. Not favoritism. A fair reading of the facts. With Art beside me, I went to the independent directors, the 2 outsiders my father had added to satisfy the bank, a retired judge and a woman who had run her own regional carrier. These were not people who could be charmed by Peter's smile or swayed by whose child was whose. I sat across from each of them and did the least dramatic thing imaginable. I walked them through the loan agreement, line by line, and showed them how close the company was to breaching it. I reminded them, gently, of something they already knew. A director's duty is not to the man in the CEO's chair. It is to the company itself, and to the creditors and employees who would be harmed if it failed. Once a solvency threat is on the table, you cannot unknow it. By the time I left, no one was talking about family anymore. They were talking about exposure and liability, and what a responsible board is required to do. And then the bank did what banks do when they smell smoke. It was nothing dramatic. No threat, no ultimatum. Just a single, polite letter from Meridian to the company's board, noting that recent borrowing had brought Doyle Freight near the limit set in its loan agreement, and requesting a plan to address it within 30 days. Routine language. Devastating timing. Because that letter was not from me. It was not sour grapes or a bitter sister's opinion. It was the market itself, in writing, confirming every single thing I had put in the memo my father read 3 lines of. A director can wave away a family member. No one on that board could wave away a formal notice from the institution that held the company's debt. Peter had spent weeks telling everyone I was exaggerating. The bank had just, very quietly, told everyone I was right. Peter came to see me for the first time since the lockout. He did not knock so much as arrive, filling my doorway with all his easy charm gone brittle. He had assumed the special meeting was some tantrum he could smooth over with our father. It was only when the corporate attorney confirmed my notice was valid, that the board had no choice but to convene, and that the bank's letter would be on the table when it did, that the ground finally moved under him. He tried the old tools first. He reminded me we were family. He said Dad would be devastated. When that didn't work, he switched to numbers he didn't understand and couldn't defend, and I watched him realize, mid-sentence, that he could not answer a single question I was about to be asked in that room. You planned this, he said, almost in wonder. No, I told him. I just read the paperwork, you never bothered to. I did not have to wait long for the story to tell itself. 2 weeks before the board meeting, the thing I had feared for a year finally happened. Coastal Grocers, the customer Peter's entire expansion depended on, declined to renew at the volume he had assumed. Their new head of logistics did exactly what I had warned he would. He split the freight across 3 carriers, keeping Doyle as one of them, but cutting our share by nearly half. It was simply what a careful buyer does when he stops being certain his partner is stable. Peter learned about it in a terse email. I learned about it the same afternoon, from one of the buyers I had known for a decade, who called to tell me himself because he said, I had always been straight with him. The pillar Peter never checked had just come out from under the roof. After that, the covenant breach stopped being a projection on my kitchen table, and became a line in an official report. With Coastal's volume gone and the new debt fully drawn, the ratio the loan required simply broke. There was no dramatic moment, no alarm, just a quarterly compliance certificate that could no longer be signed truthfully. Meridian Bank sent its second letter, and this one had teeth. The company was now in technical default. The bank did not have to seize anything to hurt us. It only had to remind everyone that it could. It froze further borrowing and demanded a turnaround plan from the board. Peter's grand expansion was not just paused. It had legally detonated the very foundation the company was standing on. And the board meeting I had called, once a formality he'd hoped to survive, was suddenly the only room where the company's future could be decided. There was one more thing Peter had not thought through, and it was the cruelest of all. To get the expansion loan approved so quickly, he had done what our father once made me do in the lean years. He had signed a personal guarantee. He had put his own name and his own house behind a portion of that debt, so eager to look decisive that he never reckoned with what would happen if they turned. The man who locked me out to establish clean lines of authority had personally tied himself to a loan now sliding into default. Part of me, the tired and humiliated part, wanted him to feel every ounce of the fear he had waved away in me. But a larger part of me just felt the old dread come back. Because his exposure was the company's exposure, and the company was still full of people I loved. My father called me the night before the meeting. His voice was not the voice of the man who had told me I'd forgotten how to let the company grow. He had finally sat with the numbers, and he understood that the bank letter was real, that Coastal was real, that his son's personal signature was real. He did not apologize. My father has never in his life said the words "I'm sorry." But he asked me a question he had never once asked before. What did I think we should do? For 26 years I had waited to be asked that, and now that it came, there was no triumph in it, only exhaustion. I told him the company could still be saved, but not by the person who had steered it into the rocks. And then I told him it would not be my decision, or his. It would be the board's. And so we come to the morning everything had been building toward. The board of Doyle Freight convened in the same conference room where I had once presented the plan that saved the company. The room I had been barred from entering weeks earlier. I was let in this time, not as a guest and not as anyone's daughter, but as the largest shareholder in the company. Peter sat at the head of the table, still in the CEO's chair, though we all knew by then that the chair was only furniture. My father sat to the side, smaller than I had ever seen him. The bank's letters and the numbers were on the table. Everything I had warned about, in writing, for over a year, was finally in the one room where it could no longer be forwarded away with two dismissive words. And then the chairman called the meeting to order. When my turn came, I did not make a speech about betrayal. I had promised myself that whatever else happened in that room, I would not hand them the angry, wounded woman they expected. I stood, and I walked the board through it the way I had walked those trucks back from the edge years before. Calmly, in order, with the documents in front of every seat. Here was the loan agreement. Here was the covenant we had breached. Here was the Coastal contract, and the volume that had vanished. Here was the memo I had sent a year ago, dated and unanswered, predicting the exact morning we were now living in. I did not raise my voice once. Every number I said out loud was already in the packet in front of them, and every number agreed with me. Then it was Peter's turn, and this was the part one had not been able to predict, because I had never seen my brother truly cornered. He talked about vision, about momentum, about how great companies are built by people willing to take risks. For a moment, the old magic almost worked. But then the retired judge asked him a simple question. Given the breach, what was his specific plan to bring the company back into compliance within the bank's 30 days? Peter opened his mouth, and nothing came out that meant anything. He pivoted to optimism. The judge asked again more quietly. And in that silence, everyone in the room understood the difference between a man who could sell the future and a woman who could actually run the present. His charm had no numbers behind it. Mine did. The vote took less than 5 minutes, and nothing about it was theatrical. The chairman asked whether the board still had confidence in its chief executive to lead through the crisis the company now faced. Art Mendez voted first, and he did not look at me or at Peter when he did. He looked at the balance sheet. Even my father, when it came to him, sat very still, and then, in a voice I barely recognized, voted for the survival of the thing he had built over the son he loved. It was not close. The board removed Peter as chief executive and asked me to take operational control of the company I had spent my life keeping alive. No one applauded. It was not that kind of victory. I want to be honest about what winning looked like, because it was not a celebration. What I inherited that afternoon was not a prize. It was a company in default with 30 days to prove it deserved to survive. I spent the next months doing the unglamorous work, renegotiating with Meridian, cutting the reckless parts of the expansion, rebuilding trust with Coastal. We saved the company, but not all of Peter's dream, and not the debt his signature had promised. He kept his shares, but stepped away from operations entirely. There was no perfect justice in it, no moment where everything wrong was suddenly made right. There was only a company that would live, and the quiet satisfaction of having been the one who made sure of it. People always ask me if my father and I ever made peace. He never gave me the apology I had earned, and I stopped waiting, because I finally understood my worth had never depended on it. But something changed. He started asking my opinion before decisions instead of after. He came to the yard sometimes and just watched the trucks roll out, standing beside me in silence. Once near the end, he told a room full of strangers that his daughter was the finest operator he had ever known. Not his son, his daughter. He said it as if it were ordinary, not the sentence I had waited my whole life to hear. It was not forgiveness, exactly. It was something quieter and more honest. Recognition, arriving late, but arriving on its own. If you are watching this because something like it happened to you, because someone decided your quiet, steady work was worth less than a louder person's charm, I want to leave you with one thing. They can take your title. They can change the locks and write you out of the memo. But they cannot take what you actually built, and they cannot rewrite the numbers once the numbers come due. I did not win because I was owed something, or because my family finally loved me. I won because I understood the company, and they only understood the story they told about it. So thank you for staying with me to the end. Take care of yourself, and remember, the proof was never in a folder. It was in the trucks that were still running.